Somewhere inside a nondescript federal building in Washington, D.C., there are servers that hold the financial pulse of the most powerful government on Earth. Payment records, Social Security disbursements, veterans benefit transfers, intelligence agency payroll. Every dollar the United States government moves, every single transaction, flows through a small number of interconnected systems that most Americans have never heard of. Systems so sensitive that even senior officials within the agencies that use them are not permitted full access. Systems protected, or so everyone believed, by decades of security protocol, congressional oversight, and constitutional law. In early 2025, something changed, and the people who spent their careers guarding those systems were not prepared for what came next. This is not a story about a foreign adversary. This is not a story about a rogue hacker operating from a basement in another country. This is a story about what happened inside the United States government itself. About access that was granted where it had never been granted before. About data that was touched by hands that, legally and historically, should never have been able to reach it. And about the silence that followed, a silence that some officials described as more alarming than the breach itself. To understand what happened, you have to understand what these systems actually are. The Treasury Department's Bureau of the Fiscal Service manages what is known as the Federal Payment System. It is, in simple terms, the American government's financial backbone. It processes trillions of dollars in payments every year. Social Security checks, Medicare reimbursements, military salaries, tax refunds, federal contractor payments, the accounts of intelligence agencies. If you have ever received money from the U.S. government in any form, that money almost certainly passed through this system. And if you are an adversary of the United States trying to understand the government's financial architecture, which agencies are funded, how much, how often, and to whom, access to this system would be, in the words of one former intelligence official, a counterintelligence catastrophe. For decades, access to these systems was governed by strict legal frameworks, career civil servants with extensive background clearances, congressional authorization, inspector general oversight, layers of human and technical review designed specifically to prevent any single person, group, or outside entity from gaining a broad view of the government's financial operations. The rules were not bureaucratic formality, they were national security architecture. Then came DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, not technically a government agency, not established by Congress, not subject to the standard confirmation or oversight processes that govern executive departments, arrived in Washington in early 2025 with a mandate described publicly as cutting waste, eliminating redundancy, and streamlining a federal bureaucracy that, its architects argued, had grown bloated beyond function. The pitch was simple. The execution was anything but. Within weeks of its formation, DOGE operatives, many of them young engineers and technologists with backgrounds in private sector companies, some with little to no prior government experience, and in some cases, security clearances that were still being processed, were embedded inside federal agencies. Treasury, the Social Security Administration, the Office of Personnel Management, the Department of Education, agency after agency found itself hosting DOGE representatives who arrived with one directive:
gain access to the systems, review the data, and identify cuts. But what does it mean to review the data inside a federal payment system? It means seeing who is paid. It means seeing what programs the money flows through. It means understanding at a structural level the financial circulatory system of the United States government. It means accessing information that, in the wrong hands, or even in earnest hands without proper vetting, represents a map. A map of government operations, a map of intelligence funding streams, a map of every pressure point in the system. Former federal officials who spent careers inside these agencies began speaking out almost immediately. Not through press releases, not through formal channels that could be easily dismissed. They went to courts. Career employees at the Treasury Department filed emergency legal actions in early 2025, arguing that the access being granted to DOJ personnel was not only unprecedented, it was illegal. Specific claims emerged that individuals with unfinished security clearance processes had been given read and in some cases write access to systems containing the personal financial data of millions of Americans, as well as the payment architecture of agencies whose operational security depends on exactly this kind of information remaining compartmentalized. A federal judge issued a temporary restraining order, then another. Legal battles multiplied across multiple jurisdictions, and through it all, the public narrative remained remarkably focused on dollar amounts, billions saved here, thousands of employees laid off there, while the quieter, more technically complex question lingered almost entirely beneath the surface. Who actually had their hands on the data, and what did they do with it? That question became significantly more complicated when names began to emerge. Not all of the DOJ operatives were anonymous. Some were young engineers whose social media histories, public affiliations, and professional backgrounds became subjects of intense scrutiny. In at least one documented case, a DOJ employee who had been granted access to Treasury systems was found to have had prior connections to individuals later identified as security concerns. The details of what followed, whether access was revoked, whether data was audited, whether any breach actually occurred, were handled not through public disclosure, but through quiet internal processes that career officials described as wholly inadequate. But what happened next shocked everyone. It was not the Treasury breach that dominated intelligence conversations in the spring of 2025. It was a different system entirely. The Office of Personnel Management, the same agency that had been catastrophically hacked by Chinese intelligence a decade earlier, in one of the most damaging data breaches in American history, was once again a focal point. OPM holds the personnel files of millions of current and former federal employees, including those with security clearances. It holds the results of background investigations, documents that detail the personal histories, foreign contacts, financial vulnerabilities, and potential pressure points of America's intelligence and military workforce. When DOJ operatives arrived at OPM, the alarm that went through the intelligence community was not hypothetical. Former CIA officers, former NSA directors, and current officials who could not speak publicly made their concerns known through intermediaries, through lawyers, and eventually through congressional testimony. The word used in private briefings, according to multiple reports, was the same word used in the aftermath of the 2015 Chinese hack: catastrophic. Because here is what that data represents. If you know which Americans hold security clearances, you know who the government trusts. If you know their personal histories, their family situations, their financial conditions, you know who might be vulnerable to recruitment or pressure. If you know which agencies they work for and at what level, you understand the architecture of American intelligence from the inside. The Chinese operation in 2015 had taken that data through stealth, through years of patient cyber intrusion. In 2025, the concern was not a foreign power in the dark. The concern was access being handed over in broad daylight, with unclear vetting, unclear oversight, and unclear legal authority. Someone inside already knew the danger, multiple someones, and they were not being heard. The legal landscape became increasingly complex as the months wore on. Courts issued rulings. Some were reversed on appeal. The administration argued that executive authority permitted the kind of efficiency review being conducted. Career civil servants argued that specific statutes, laws governing the Privacy Act, the Federal Information Security Management Act, clearance procedures enshrined in executive orders going back decades were being violated in ways that had no legal precedent. And through all of it, the technical question remained unresolved in any public forum. What was actually accessed? By whom? Was any of it copied, transmitted, or stored outside of government systems? And crucially, was any of it shared with entities outside the United States government? That last question was the one that intelligence officials found most difficult to answer. Not because they believed the answer was yes,
but because they lacked the tools to definitively say no. When you grant access to a system and the people receiving that access operate outside the normal chains of accountability, outside the Inspector General framework, outside the standard logging and auditing protocols that govern cleared personnel, you lose the ability to reconstruct what happened. You lose the audit trail. And in national security terms, losing the audit trail is not a technical inconvenience. It is the loss of truth itself. It means you cannot know what you lost. And not knowing what you lost is in many ways more dangerous than knowing the worst. There's a principle in counterintelligence known as the unknown unknown. It is the threat you cannot defend against because you do not know it exists. For decades, American intelligence agencies have invested enormous resources in trying to eliminate unknown unknowns, to know as precisely as possible what adversaries know, what they have stolen, what advantage they hold. The access granted to DOJ in 2025 introduced, by the assessment of multiple former senior officials, a significant expansion of the unknown unknown, not because malicious intent was proven, but because the conditions for knowing, the oversight, the logging, the accountability were absent. And the truth was far darker than most people realized, because the concern was not only about what might have been taken, it was about what might have been changed. Right access to federal payment systems is not merely a privacy issue. It's not merely a financial issue. If an unauthorized party, or even an authorized party acting outside legal parameters, can modify records in a federal disbursement system, the implications extend far beyond a stolen check. Social Security eligibility records, federal contractor payment authorizations, agency budget allocations stored at the operational level. If any of those records are altered, even subtly, even in ways designed to look like clerical corrections, the downstream consequences can take months or years to fully manifest. And by the time they do, reconstructing the original chain of authorization becomes extraordinarily difficult. Career officials at the Treasury Department raised these concerns in sworn declarations filed with federal courts. They described being pressured to provide access they believed was unlawful. They described colleagues who refused and found themselves reassigned, placed on administrative leave, or effectively forced out of positions they had held for decades. They described an environment in which the normal mechanisms for raising concerns, the Inspector General, the legal counsel, the chain of command, had been either bypassed or rendered inaccessible by the speed and authority with which the DOJ operation moved. The speed was not accidental. Those who study how institutions are captured, how oversight mechanisms are neutralized, how accountability frameworks are bypassed, will recognize the pattern. Move fast. Create facts on the ground before legal challenges can be fully mounted. Frame any resistance as obstruction of a popular mandate. And by the time the courts, the Congress, and the public fully understand what has happened, the access is already exercised, the data is already been seen, and the moment of maximum vulnerability is already past. Whether that vulnerability was exploited, whether the access granted in those early weeks of 2025 resulted in anything that will one day be revealed as a breach, a compromise, or an intelligence loss, is a question that may not be answered publicly for years, perhaps decades, perhaps never, if the oversight mechanisms that would normally produce that answer remain compromised. What is known is this. Multiple federal courts found in preliminary rulings that aspects of the DOJ access to federal systems were likely unlawful. Career officials with exemplary records and decades of service described conditions inside agencies that they characterized as unlike anything they had seen in their professional lifetimes. Former intelligence directors made public statements using language that in their professional careers they had reserved for describing foreign espionage operations. And the technical systems at the heart of the American government's financial and personnel architecture were accessed by individuals whose vetting, in at least some documented cases, did not meet the standards legally required for the clearance level of the information they were touching. The question that haunts this story is not whether mistakes were made. Mistakes were made. The question is whether those mistakes were made in the ordinary way, through haste,
through ideological overconfidence, through a genuine but reckless belief that the rules governing these systems were bureaucratic obstacles rather than national security necessities, or whether the mistakes were something else. Because there's another layer to this story that received almost no sustained public attention. The man at the center of Doge, Elon Musk,
is not merely a domestic figure. He is a global businessman with contractual relationships with foreign governments, with communication systems operating in contested geopolitical spaces, with satellites delivering connectivity to military operations in active conflict zones, and with personal financial interests spanning multiple countries. The question of whether any individual in that position should hold the level of access to U.S. government systems that Doge operatives were granted is not a partisan question. It is a structural question. It is a question that counterintelligence professionals are trained to ask about anyone, regardless of nationality, loyalty, or stated intentions, whose personal exposure to foreign influence creates the theoretical conditions for compromise. That question was asked by intelligence officials, by members of Congress, by former officials who understood its weight. The answers given were not satisfactory. The oversight mechanisms that should have produced more definitive answers were not, in the assessment of those asking, functioning as designed. And so the unknown unknown remained and grew. There's a particular kind of fear that exists inside institutions that have been built over generations to guard against existential threats. It is not the fear of a known enemy. It is the fear of having failed at the one thing the institution was designed to prevent without knowing it, without being able to prove it, without being able to sound the alarm in a way that changes anything, because the systems that would normally amplify the alarm have been quietly, efficiently, systematically turned off. That is the fear that career officials described in 2025. Not with certainty, not with proof of the worst outcome, but with the knowledge that the conditions for the worst outcome had been created, and with the haunting, specific dread of professionals who know exactly what those conditions mean. America has faced foreign espionage operations that took years to uncover. It has faced cyber intrusions so sophisticated that the full extent of what was taken may never be known. It has faced insider threats, double agents, and compromised systems at the highest levels of its intelligence apparatus. In each of those cases, the response, however delayed, however imperfect, was built on the architecture of accountability. The Inspector General, the Oversight Committee, the classified brief to congressional leadership, the audit, the investigation. In 2025, some of those systems still functioned. Courts pushed back. Some access was curtailed. Some legal battles produced temporary victories for those arguing that the law meant what it said. But the pace of access had already outrun the pace of oversight in the critical early weeks, and the question of what happened in that window, in those first days and weeks when Doge moved through federal systems with minimal resistance, remains, in the most precise and consequential sense of the word, classified. Not because the government decided to classify it, but because the mechanisms that would have generated an unclassified answer were not in place when it mattered. History has a way of returning to the questions that were never fully answered. The Church Committee, convened in the 1970s to investigate intelligence abuses, produced its findings years after the abuses occurred. The 911 Commission produced its report years after the failures it documented. The full story of what happened inside America's most sensitive government systems in the first months of 2025 will, one day, be the subject of a similar reckoning. The question is what will have already been lost by then? What map will have been drawn? What vulnerabilities will have been exposed? What names will have been seen by the wrong eyes? What amounts will have been moved through channels that should never have been touched? And whether the people responsible for preventing exactly this will be able to look at the record, the full record, the real record, the record that exists beyond the press releases and the court filings and the public statements, and explain, honestly, how they let it happen. The servers are still running. The data is still there. The access logs, where they exist, are still waiting to be read by someone with the authority and the courage to read them. Whether that someone ever gets the chance is the question that for now, no one in power seems willing to answer. And that silence, more than any single breach, more than any single name, more than any single system that was accessed on a quiet morning in January 2025, is the most telling detail of all.